Tabitha and the Almost Impossible Quest. Written and read by Shan McFadden. Gather round, friends, listen if you're able, while we tell the tale of an epic fable, with a girl on a quest for a shiny crown, and our story begins in this tiny town. The village was in an uproar. Children ran through the streets shouting, "The oracle is coming! The great oracle is coming! Hurry quick!" Within moments, a huge congregation had gathered at the village square. A hush fell over the crowd as the oracle arrived. She was tall and imposing in her ornate robes, and when she spoke, her voice shook the windows of the little village huts. "I am the great oracle, the seer of all and sacred guardian of the kingdom, and I come bearing a proclamation." "What's a proclamation? Some kind of cake?" said a rude little voice from somewhere in the crowd, causing a group of village children to stifle their giggles. The oracle scowled as she peered into the villagers' faces, looking for the source of the obnoxious comments. When she couldn't locate the culprit, the oracle continued. "A proclamation is an important announcement." "I would have preferred a cake," came the rude little voice again, and this time the village children couldn't contain their laughter. They giggled and chortled and straight up guffawed until the oracle shouted, "Silence!" When she was absolutely certain that every man, woman, and child in the crowd was listening reverently, she gave her great proclamation. "For too long this kingdom has lain in the grip of chaos," she said, and everyone in the village knew that it was true. A great battle had claimed the life of the last great emperor, and left the kingdom with no leader and no heir to the throne. Local warlords battled for control of the region, which left the kingdom in a state of perpetual civil war. A strong leader was required to unify the people and bring peace to the land. The oracle then decreed that 2 participants would compete in a quest to locate the crown of destiny, which was hidden in the secret tomb of the last great emperor. To find the tomb, the competitors would have to brave the dangers of the dreaded Dire Swamp, a place so deadly that few people ventured there and fewer still ever returned. Whomever held the crown of destiny at the quest's completion would be named emperor or empress. She then announced the first participant as Prince Skippy of Silkbridge. Prince Skippy was a spoiled dandy who wore fancy robes and liked to keep his hair and mustachio impeccably neat. His only claim to the throne was that his father's great-uncle's niece had once married the last great emperor's grandmother's cousin's nephew, which Prince Skippy insisted made him and the previous emperor practically brothers. As the last great emperor's only living, albeit distant relative, Skippy was guaranteed the opportunity to compete for the crown, even though he abhorred the idea of getting sweaty and dirty. He was spoiled and foolish, but he also had the wide-eyed innocence of a child. Prince Skippy pranced through the crowd until he reached the oracle, where he said, "Oh, oracle, I just can't wait to be emperor. I can't wait, I can't wait, I can't wait." The oracle rolled her eyes and shot Skippy a reproachful look as the prince addressed the crowd. "Attention, filthy peasants," he said. "I'm honored to accept this hallowed quest and look forward to becoming your new and beloved emperor." "You'll never be emperor," said the rude little voice in the crowd again. "Well, why not?" said Prince Skippy with a pout. "Because you're a weenie," said the voice, and the entire crowd erupted in laughter. Even the oracle seemed to be suppressing a chuckle. The prince's eyes got very big and his face got very red, and he said, "I am not a weenie. I am not, I am not, I am not. When I build my new palace, I'm going to flatten this village and build the royal swimming pool in its place." Then he called out, "Zabera, make them stop teasing me." A mysterious-looking woman strode toward him, parting the crowd with little more than an icy glare. Much like the oracle, she wore a hooded robe that was covered in ancient and cryptic symbols. In her hand she carried a gnarled staff with an ominous luminescent green crystal mounted at the top. She was accompanied by a pair of goblins, fierce-looking creatures with green skin and pointed ears. The goblins whispered menacingly to one another and threatened the villagers with glints of their sharp teeth. With a strained smile, the mysterious-looking woman said, "Hello, mother." The oracle narrowed her eyes and said, "Zabera, It's certainly not like you to sacrifice in service to another. I certainly hope that you aren't in this for your own benefit. If you have plans to take the throne for yourself, I promise you, you will not succeed. I've placed a hex on the crown so that no magic user may complete this quest." Zobeira and the oracle locked eyes, and for a moment no one in the crowd dared to speak or take a breath. Zobeira held her mother's gaze and said, "Oh, Mother, we can't all be as selfless as you, but I assure you my only intention is to help the rightful emperor gain his kingdom." Then, with a belligerent smirk on her lips, Zobeira turned to the prince and said, "Sire, I've brought along my goblin servants. They are excellent trackers. They should be able to easily navigate the dire swamp and help us to avoid any unnecessary peril." The goblins shambled forward and crouched by their master's side. Prince Skippy's eyes grew very large as he said, "Oh, goblins! I'd heard that all goblins were treacherous backstabbers. Are you sure we can trust them?" Zobeira narrowed her eyes and said, "Fear not, sire. These goblins are completely loyal to me." Then she turned quickly to the goblins and in a hushed voice said, "Listen, you two had better not be plotting anything. You do exactly as I say, or there will be consequences." The goblins, Grumbleguts and his sister Grimworthy, fell to their knees and threw their hands in the air and wailed,
"Oh no, Mistress Zobeira, we would never deceive you. You are the sun that warms our weary boneses,"
moaned Grimworthy.
"You are the moon that lights our dark night skieses,"
groaned Grumbleguts.
"You are the rain that washes our dirty feetses,"
howled Grimworthy. Zobeira silenced the goblins with an annoyed scowl and then stroked her chin thoughtfully. She now found herself in quite a predicament, because of course she'd had no intention of ever turning the crown over to the prince. Her offer to aid him had been a ruse, a bit of subterfuge designed to get her close to the crown so that she could claim it for herself without arousing the oracle's suspicion. Now, with the hex preventing any magic user from completing the quest, she would be forced to help Skippy complete his crusade. But she was as uncompromising and resolute as she was deceitful, so she formulated a plan, which she revealed to the goblins in arcane whispers. "We'll have to actually help this idiot complete his quest," she told them. "But once the quest is done, the spell will be broken. Then, before our new emperor can officially take the throne, we—" She drew her finger quickly across her throat.
"We tickles his neck,"
said Grumbleguts.
"We buys him a bow tie?"
asked Grimworthy. "No, you fools," Zobeira snapped. "We will eliminate him, and I will claim the crown as the new and all-powerful empress." Grumbleguts looked at Grimworthy, and Grimworthy looked at Grumbleguts, and something quite sinister passed between them. They began conversing in whispers and muted cackles. Again, Zobeira demanded to know if they were plotting against her. In mock astonishment, the goblins violently shook their heads that no, they absolutely were not plotting anything. But as soon as Zobeira turned her back, the goblins resumed their suspicious whispering and cackling. Meanwhile, Prince Skippy was now completely flustered by the continued jeering he was receiving from the crowd of onlookers. The village children taunted him, and the rude little heckler in the crowd continued to insist that Skippy was nothing more than a pretentious, spoiled weenie. With a sniffle, Prince Skippy said, "Zobeira, I demand respect from these ignorant peasants." "Of course, sire," hissed Zobeira. "I've hired some mercenaries to deal with the riffraff. Send in the rogues." With this, she made a sharp gesture to the back of the crowd, and a moment later, two imposing figures pushed their way forward. The first was a towering beast who looked for all intents like a tiger walking on its two hind legs. The great tiger man wore a vest and a pair of weathered trousers, but other than that, his appearance was 100% tiger-like. He was covered in furry stripes of orange, black, and white. Long whiskers surrounded his small pink nose, and his mouth housed a row of razor-sharp teeth, which he bared in a frightful grimace. The second figure was a fierce-looking pirate with a scruffy beard and a wild glint in his eye. He swung a sharpened cutlass above his head, which he used to intimidate the crowd. The villagers backed away from the two rogues as they approached Zobeira and the prince. The pirate spoke in a gravelly voice as he said, "Ahoy there! I be Griff Roughhouser, the most vile pirate ever to sail the seven seas, and this be my first mate, a lethal tiger man." Prince Skippy looked perfectly delighted as he said, "Oh, Tiger Man, I've heard they're incredibly fierce. Well, hello there, Tiger Man. I'm very excited to meet you." With a beaming smile, Prince Skippy offered his hand in a friendly gesture, but as the Tiger Man loomed above him, fangs and claws bared, the prince suddenly thought better of it, and with a timid gulp, he began to slowly back away. Before Skippy could withdraw completely, the Tiger Man clamped his great paw around the prince's hand and began shaking it vigorously. Any fierceness disappeared from the Tiger Man's face as he said, "It's an honor to meet you, your highness. I'm Terence P. Tigerman, Esquire. I'm a classically trained actor, and I'll be playing the part of your rogue on this quest." Prince Skippy gave a confused and disappointed look and said, "Why, you're not fierce at all." The pirate Griff Roughhouser looked annoyed and muttered something under his breath, but Terence P. Tigerman just ignored him. He assured the prince that as a classically trained actor, he was capable of conveying a wide variety of emotions, including ferocity, sadness, joy, confusion, hunger, and contentment, each of which he demonstrated with exaggerated expressions and theatrical postures. With a pout, Prince Skippy said, "This is most disappointing. Zabera, make him stop talking." Zabera waved her staff in front of Terence's face, and immediately the Tiger Man's voice went silent. He continued to move his lips, but absolutely no sound came out. In a panic, Terence tried frantically to speak, while Griff struggled to calm him down. Then, with one final glare at the oracle, Zabera turned on her heel and led Prince Skippy and the goblins away, off toward the dire swamp and the commencement of their quest. No sooner had she left the village than Terence's voice suddenly returned. In a panic, he whined, "Did you see what she did to me with her magic? I thought I'd lost my beautiful voice forever." Griff rolled his eyes, and when he spoke, his pirate accent was gone. "Just relax, you big baby," said Griff. "You're fine now." But Terence didn't feel fine. You see, Terence and Griff were nice guys who often found themselves in a questionable line of work. Because of his intimidating presence, Terence was often given jobs as a bodyguard or as hired muscle, and being a somewhat gentle soul, he hated every minute of it. But Griff, while generally good at heart, was quick to take any job that paid well, no matter how unscrupulous the employer. The reason for his lack of discrimination when it came to finding work was that Griff, more than anything in the entire world, wanted to buy his own pirate ship. He came from a long line of pirates. His dad had been a pirate, his mom had been a pirate, as had her family before her. And by any means necessary, Griff was going to buy his own ship, so that he could become a real honest-to-goodness pirate, too. "Except you always get seasick, you can't swim, and you're afraid of the water," Terence would remind him with a chuckle.
"By golly, you take that back, Terence," Griff would snarl back. "I'm not afraid of the water. I'm afraid of drowning. There's a difference, you know."
This, of course, was quite true. Fear of water and fear of drowning, while closely related, are two very different things. But one thing they have in common is that both phobias make for a very, very poor pirate. Griff knew this all too well, and it filled him with embarrassment and dread, which somehow only clouded his judgment further and fueled his desire to buy his own ship. So this is how Terence and Griff, two good guys who worked for bad guys, found themselves trudging off into the dire swamp in the employment of Zabera the sorceress. "That sorceress is bad news," whispered Terence nervously. "And did you see those creepy goblins?" Under his breath, Griff shot back,
"Knock it off, T. We need this job."
Moments later, they disappeared into the gloom of the swamp. The oracle watched them go, then spoke to the crowd again. "It is now time to name the quest's second participant," she said.
"What sucker's going to get stuck with that job?"
came the rude little voice in the crowd again. The villagers gave another burst of rowdy laughter. The oracle turned with incredible speed and pointed her finger at a spot in the crowd and boomed, "Tabitha Abigail Jones, stop hiding and step forward." The crowd parted to reveal the source of the rude little voice. A small peasant girl wearing a frayed dress and tattered shoes. "Me? What do you want with me?" said Tabitha as she stumbled forward, past the astonished faces of her friends and neighbors. She protested intensely, saying that she was just a regular peasant girl and not the type of person the oracle was looking for. With a stern expression, the oracle said, "If you didn't want to be chosen, you shouldn't have made so many rude and sarcastic comments. If you succeed, you will be crowned the new empress. If you fail, your home will become a swimming pool for a spoiled brat." In a panic, Tabitha shouted, "But that prince guy has a sorceress and goblins and a tiger man." "And you won't be alone either," said the oracle. She then revealed the first of Tabitha's traveling companions, an archer named Shaolin. Now, Shaolin wasn't just a good archer, she was the greatest archer of all time. She'd picked up her first bow when she was 2 years old, and she hadn't missed a shot since. Not a single shot. "It's really kind of boring being this good," said Shaolin with a casual shrug. "I actually try to miss sometimes, but it never works. I still hit the target every single time. My reflexes are just too strong." The oracle then introduced Tabitha's second companion, a knight named Sir Gladys the Swift. Although she wore a big shiny helmet and carried a huge sword, Sir Gladys was quite small for a knight. She attempted to hoist her sword over her head, but buckled under the weight and teetered back and forth precariously before finally dropping the weapon to the ground.
"Whew, either that sword's getting bigger or I'm getting smaller," said Sir Gladys as she removed her helmet to reveal long white hair and a wrinkled face.
"She must be 100 years old," said Shaolin as she burst into laughter. Truth be told, Sir Gladys was not 100 years old. She was 98 and proud of it. From an early age, she'd been gifted with super speed, a result of her mother being part wood nymph, and in her youth could run around the earth in the blink of an eye without getting tired. Now, as an elderly woman, Sir Gladys could only manage more modest displays of super speed. Unconvinced, Shaolin scoffed that Sir Gladys was either a lunatic or a liar, and demanded that she prove just how fast she was.
"I can't do it now," said Sir Gladys as she slung her tattered handbag over her shoulder. "I haven't had my tea yet, and at my age I really need the caffeine boost to get me going. Besides, these days I can only manage a few minutes of super speed before I get tuckered out. If I show you my powers now, I'll end up napping all afternoon."
"There's no time for napping," said the oracle. "You must leave now or surrender the victory to your opponent. Do you accept your quest, Tabitha?" Faced with this precarious decision, Tabitha sat on the ground with her chin in her hands and thought and thought and thought. On one hand, she didn't want to go running around a dangerous swamp with an arrogant archer and a crazy old lady. But on the other hand, she didn't want her village to be demolished to make way for Prince Skippy's swimming pool. She looked around at the expectant faces of the villagers, and then with a shrug she said, "Fine, I'll do it." A cheer rose up from the gathering, and when it finally died down, the oracle said, "Then go. Face the challenge of the dire swamp and retrieve the crown of destiny. Along the way you will meet Bartleby Nightshade, the world's greatest thief. Convince him to help you, and you may just save your village." Moments later, Tabitha, Shaolin, and Sir Gladys were on their way. The dire swamp was, as one might expect, a hazardous and unpleasant place to be. A series of intertwining muddy paths wound through the swamp, surrounded by deep bogs and marshes. It was invariably dark and gloomy, and home to a wide variety of exotic and dangerous beasts. Before long, they had been accosted by crocodiles, anacondas, panthers, grizzly bears, and even a rogue rhinoceros, all of which Shaolin dispatched easily with her bow. They stopped to catch their breath in a small clearing, but as they did, Sir Gladys frowned and said,
"Girls, I feel like we're being watched."
And sure enough, they were being watched. Behind them, a large shrub began tiptoeing away into the shadows. "Who's there?" shouted Tabitha. "No one, just a shrub," came a quiet, frightened voice. Shaolin drew her bow, aimed it at the mysterious bush, and said, "Well, if you're just a shrub, you won't mind a few arrows in your branches." With a yelp, the shrub threw off its leafy disguise to reveal a timid-looking man underneath. He had a short beard and wild-looking eyes, and he wore dark clothing with a hood that framed his head. He was trembling, and he had one arm hidden behind his back. "Who are you?" demanded Tabitha. "Don't tell them, Bartleby," came a high-pitched voice. It didn't seem to be coming from the man, but rather from behind his back. With wide eyes, Tabitha said, "Did you say Bartleby? Are you Bartleby Nightshade?" "Don't tell them anything," came the mysterious voice again.
"It sounds like there's someone behind his back,"
said Sir Gladys. "Show us your other hand, now," said Shaolin. The man very slowly extended his hand to reveal that it was covered by a bright blue sock, with big googly eyes and a pink tongue. "Is that a puppet?" asked Tabitha.
"You're a puppet, lady,"
said the sock puppet in an angry, high-pitched voice. With a panic expression, the man whispered, "Be quiet, Mr. Wump, you'll get us in trouble." "Oh, man, he's talking to a sock," said Shaolin as she shook with laughter. The sock puppet growled and hissed at her with great animosity. As Tabitha had suspected, the strange man was in fact the fellow the oracle had told them about, Bartleby Nightshade, the world's greatest thief. However, he was hardly the legendary figure they'd been expecting, wild-eyed and anxious, talking to a sock puppet in the middle of nowhere. But as Bartleby told his story, the reason for his current disposition became quite clear. Although he was a thief, Bartleby Nightshade was famous for being extremely generous to those less fortunate. He was always stealing from the corrupt so that he could provide for the poor and the suffering, and such was the case when he'd stolen a bag of gold from an unscrupulous warlord and hidden in the dire swamp to avoid being captured by the warlord's guards. He quickly became lost and had wandered the dire swamp alone for weeks, frightened and confused and alone. That was until he'd found Mr. Wump. "Mr. Wump?" said Tabitha as she gave the puppet a suspicious glare. "He's a powerful and mysterious magical creature that talks to me and tells me what to do. He takes care of me," said Bartleby earnestly. With a smirk, Shaolin said, "Dude, seriously? It's a sock." Mr. Wump lunged at Shaolin and said, "Come here and say that. I'll bite your nose so hard." It looked like Shaolin and Mr. Wump would come to blows before Tabitha intervened. She was still confused as to how Bartleby had been lost for so long, without eventually finding his way out of the swamp. Bartleby became very agitated. Trembling, he muttered, "It's not that simple. It's the riddles. You have to solve the riddles." "Riddles?" Tabitha repeated.
"Did somebody say riddles?"
came a frenzied voice from somewhere in the trees above them. Moments later, a bizarre figure dropped to the swamp floor. The creature was roughly the size of a tall man, but covered in thick reddish-brown fur. It wore a bright purple robe that failed to conceal its big bushy tail. On its head, the creature wore a tall pointed hat that sat perched atop furry ears. In its hand, it held a long, gnarled wooden wand.
"I am Squirrelin the Wizard, Lord of Magic and Diviner of Riddles,"
the creature bellowed. It then raised its arms and gestured to the treetops. Moments later, an army of chipmunks descended from the trees and surrounded their leader. Each chipmunk wore a hooded burlap robe tied tightly with a rope belt. The frenzied chipmunks bared their claws and snapped their sharp little teeth in an effort to intimidate Tabitha and her crew.
"Together with my loyal chipmunks, I have dedicated myself to the study and mastery of the forbidden riddles,"
Squirrelin declared, as the chipmunks chattered their rabid approval.
"We have cast a powerful enchantment on this swamp. Those who can answer my 3 riddles may pass unharmed, but those who fail will wander the swamp, lost in madness for all eternity."
With a shudder, Bartleby revealed that this was why he'd been wandering the swamp for so long. He'd attempted to solve Squirrelin's riddles and failed, and in doing so had been doomed to aimlessly roam the swamp forever. But Tabitha had a plan. "I'm actually pretty good at riddles," she said. "I'll give it a try." Squirrelin and the chipmunks roared with scornful laughter, but nonetheless, the mad wizard agreed to allow her challenge.
"So be it,"
he said with a sneer.
"What has a face and 2 hands, but no arms or legs?"
Without hesitation, Tabitha replied, "Oh, that's easy, a clock." Squirrelin and the chipmunks stood with their mouths agape, in stunned disbelief. A long, tense, quiet moment before Squirrelin screeched suddenly,
"This trickery is unacceptable!"
The chipmunks echoed his rage, leaping up and down and tearing at the earth with their sharp claws. Undeterred, Tabitha demanded that Squirrelin ask her the next riddle. With a murderous glint in his eye, Squirrelin spat,
"Riddle number 2 is this. What is as large as an elephant, yet weighs absolutely nothing?"
With a look of great satisfaction, he awaited her response, but Tabitha was just as quick to answer the second riddle. "Simple," she said. "The answer is an elephant's shadow. It's as big as an elephant, and it doesn't weigh anything." Again, Squirrelin and his followers flew into a tantrum.
"Impossible!" Squirrelin cried. "You must be using witchcraft to beguile us."
"No way, pal, she's just smart," said Shaolin. With that, they demanded the final riddle, and Squirrelin was quick to comply. Shaking with rage, he spat,
"Riddle number 3 will be your doom, girl. The riddle is this.
What is black and white, and 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 black and white?" The chipmunks bared their teeth and hissed, waiting for Tabitha's inevitable failure. But instead, she said, "I know that one. It's a penguin rolling down a hill."
"By gosh, I think she's right,"
said Sir Gladys.
"Blasphemy!"
shrieked Squirrelin, his bulging eyes so red with fury that it looked like they might pop.
"No one can answer the forbidden riddles. You are cheaters, and cheaters will not be rewarded for their treachery. As punishment, you will slumber for all eternity."
With that, Squirrelin waved his wand, and within moments, Tabitha, Shaolin, Sir Gladys, and Bartleby fell to the ground, fast asleep. Then, with a last victorious cackle, Squirrelin and his loyal chipmunks charged off into the night. Silence fell over the swamp, broken only by the soft chirping of crickets. With a groan, Bartleby's arm lifted straight up, and Mr. Wump gave a big yawn. Seeing his friends lying dormant in the swamp, the scrappy sock puppet tried valiantly to awaken them, but to no avail. Then, with great effort, Mr. Wump, still attached to Bartleby's hand, of course, dragged the unconscious thief to the nearest puddle and dunked his face in a pool of fetid swamp water. Sputtering and confused, Bartleby gasped, "Mr. Wump, what happened?"
"That nutty squirrel put you guys to sleep, but his magic didn't work on me,"
said Mr. Wump. Then he and Bartleby proceeded to awaken the rest of the crew. When Bartleby told them how Mr. Wump had saved the day, Shaolin was skeptical, and another round of bickering broke out between her and Mr. Wump. Tabitha intervened, saying, "Listen, guys, if we're going to finish this quest, we got to stop arguing and start working together like a real team." "Okay, easy, boss. Whatever you say," Shaolin conceded. Meanwhile, in another part of the swamp, Prince Skippy's quest was moving along quite nicely. Thanks to the goblins' tracking abilities, Skippy's group had managed to avoid facing Squirrelin's riddles altogether. This had given them a valuable lead over Tabitha's crew and put them that much closer to claiming the crown of destiny. The goblins, however, were getting hungry.
"Might we take a little bite of the pirate or the kitty cat? Could we just nibble their little toeses?"
asked Grimworthy as she eyed Terence and Griff, who stood off by themselves looking miserable.
"Oh yes, that would be ever so lovely,"
said Grumbleguts. "They're here to do the fighting if we need them," hissed Zabera. "You can have them once they've served their purpose, but for now, they're off limits." The goblins recoiled as Zabera threatened them with her staff, but as soon as she turned her back, Grimworthy whispered,
"Brother dear, I has an idea. Does you wants to hears it?"
His eyes glinting with the promise of treachery, Grumbleguts said,
"Oh yes, sister dear, I does wants to hear it."
And thus it was that Grimworthy detailed her treacherous plan. They would lead Zabera and the prince to the crown, but they would take their time doing it, giving Tabitha and her friends time to catch up. Then, while the sorceress was busy battling the peasant girl and her comrades, the goblins would make their move. Gleefully, Grimworthy said,
"Mistress will be so busy fighting them, she won't notice when we..."
Then she drew her finger quickly across her throat. Confused, Grumbleguts said,
"Where are we gonna find a bow tie at this time of night?"
Grimworthy patiently explained that only when she was distracted would Zabera be vulnerable enough for them to eliminate her, and then the two duplicitous goblins would claim the crown for themselves. Grumbleguts liked this plan. He liked it a lot. In fact, he even suggested that they find a way to help Tabitha and her group catch up, so they could spring their trap a little earlier. Just then, Prince Skippy declared in a pouty voice that the swamp water was ruining his robes, and that it was only a matter of time before the humidity made his mustache hair curly. He touched gingerly at his facial hair and then recoiled in horror.
"Oh no, it's happening already!" he cried. "Hurry, we have to go at once before my hair turns frizzy!"
He dragged Zabera off into the swamp, with the goblins not far behind. Once they were gone, Terence turned to Griff and with terror in his eyes said,
"I swear I heard those goblins whispering about eating us. We've got to get ourselves out of this mess."
Then he placed his hands on his hips in a theatrical gesture and said,
"I've always considered myself more of a hero than a villain anyway, rescuing princesses, saving villages, striking a dramatic pose atop an icy mountaintop, my fur blowing in the wind. So I think we should ditch these creeps and try to join up with the girl and her crew."
"But the girl doesn't have any money," Griff whined. "I want my own pirate ship, Terence. It's the only way I'll ever be a real pirate."
Before Terence could dispute his words, a loud splashing sound echoed through the swamp. Terence cocked an ear, and so did Griff, and they both knew that there was only one thing that splashed around in the swamps late at night: mermaids. Now, most people think of mermaids as delightful, gentle creatures with kind dispositions and lovely singing voices. And to some extent, they would be right. There were some mermaids that were like that. But there were also mermaids that were mean, grumpy, aggressive, and otherwise unpleasant to be around too. Because mermaids were just like regular folks. Some were wonderful, some were horrible, but most were just somewhere in between. Griff had met many mermaids in his time, but there were two mermaids in particular that he absolutely despised: Mako and her sister, Moray. Mako and Moray traveled with a pod of their younger mermaid sisters, bullying and harassing people. They took a special pleasure in humiliating and berating Griff whenever they saw him, not simply because they saw the wannabe pirate as an easy target, but also because Griff was good friends with their little sister Coral. The truth was that Griff and Coral were very good friends. In fact, Terence often teased that Coral was Griff's girlfriend, which would have been just fine with Griff had he not held such a dead-set hatred for Mako and Moray. You see, the abuse he'd received from the two mermaid bullies had caused Griff to harbor an unfair prejudice against mermaids. And even though he truly cared for Coral, he struggled to overcome his bias. Sure enough, as the splashing grew louder, Griff saw a huge pod of mermaids swimming toward them from the deeper waters of the swamp, with Mako and Moray in the lead. With a grimace, Griff said, "Oh no, not mermaids. Anything but mermaids." Mako sneered at him and said sarcastically, "Oh look, it's Griff Roughhouser, the famous pirate." With a smirk, Moray said, "If that loser's a pirate, then I'm a seahorse." Then she and Moray laughed cruelly, while their younger mermaid sisters looked on uncomfortably. "Stop laughing, it's not funny to tease people," said Coral as she swam up to join Griff. "Hi, Griff," she said apologetically. "Sorry my big sisters are being so awful." Griff shot Mako and Moray a dirty look and said, "Hi, Coral. It's not your fault they're so rude. They are mermaids after all." Griff's spiteful comment had hurt Coral's feelings deeply, but with tremendous patience she explained to Griff how Mako and Moray weren't representative of the rest of her mermaid sisters. One by one she introduced them. There was Pearl, who was always kind and truthful. There was Bubbles, the comical mermaid who was always telling jokes, and Algae, the mermaid who never understood them. There was Albacore, who loved sports, and Sushi, who loved to dance, and Limpet, a feisty little mermaid who loved to cook. There was Minnow, who loved to read and knew just about everything. And there was sweet little Guppy, the smallest of the mermaids, who loved every single person she ever met. "See, Griff," said Coral, "they're not all mean like Mako and Moray." With a smile, Griff said, "Yeah, I guess you're right. Sorry, Coral."
"Sorry, Carl," mocked Moray. "Sorry I'm a loser is more like it." "Yeah, like sorry I'm a pretend pirate," teased Mako. "Like sorry I can't even swim." With that, they each grabbed one of Griff's arms and dragged him down into the bog. Griff splashed and thrashed and screamed for help while Mako and Moray guffawed with delight. "Terrence, help me! I can't swim!" he wailed. With a sigh, Terrence rolled up his pant legs and strode impatiently into the water. He grabbed Griff by the elbow and whispered, "For goodness sakes, man, have some self-respect. You're in 3 feet of water. Just stand up." With a gasp of horror, Griff stood up to find that it was true. The water only came up to his waist. In a state of utter degradation, Griff stumbled up onto the muddy path and flopped down in a crumpled heap. Terrence gave Mako and Moray a fierce glare and snarled, "You two should be ashamed of yourselves. Get out of here and leave us alone." In between bursts of laughter, Mako and Moray shouted, "Bye, Griff. Hope you enjoyed your swim." Then they led their younger sisters away, all except a tearful Coral. She stayed behind to comfort Griff, who was completely unreceptive. He sat silently with his head in his hands, saying nothing until eventually a somber Coral left to catch up with her pod. Terrence sat with Griff in the mud and offered gently, "You okay, buddy?" For a long moment Griff said nothing. Then he sprawled out on the ground and kicked and punched the earth. He tore up clumps of mud and grasses. He pulled out a cattail by the roots and flung it into the water and shouted, "No, I'm not okay. I want to be a pirate. I want to be a pirate, Terrence. Don't you understand that? Why can't I be a pirate? Why? Why?" After a few minutes, his tantrum subsided and he sat panting and covered with mud. "We can join that girl's crew if you still want to," he said softly. "I'm never going to be a pirate anyway." As if on cue, the reeds parted and Shaolin stepped forward, covering Terrence and Griff with her bow. She was followed by Sir Gladys, Bartleby, and finally Tabitha. With his arms over his head, Terrence said, "Easy now, easy. We're not working for those evil guys anymore. We're really decent guys and we'd just like to help you." Shaolin didn't trust them, but Tabitha pointed out that she didn't trust anyone. So after much deliberation, it was decided that Terrence and Griff would be useful additions to the group. Terrence introduced his friend as Griff Roughhouser, the world-famous pirate, which seemed to brighten Griff's spirits a bit. Mr. Wump whispered something in Bartleby's ear, and Bartleby said, "Mr. Wump thinks they have honest faces." With a concerned smile, Terrence said, "Oh, gee, thanks." Then to Griff he whispered, "I think he's talking to a sock." And thus it was that Tabitha's party grew from 4 to 6 members, 7 if you counted Mr. Wump. Sir Gladys asked if she could stop for tea. She explained to the newcomers that it would give her powers of super speed, which caused Griff to burst out laughing and Shaolin to once again roll her eyes. But there was no time for tea. Despite their growing numbers, there was no denying that the group was still lost in the swamp, hopelessly lost in fact, and no closer to finding the crown than when they'd begun their quest. But no sooner had their spirits begun to wane than they heard a rustling in the bushes. A moment later, a balled-up piece of parchment landed with a wet thump in the mud ahead of them. Tabitha unfolded the mysterious parchment to find that it was a hand-drawn map of the swamp, showing the exact location of the tomb of the last great emperor. No sooner had they deciphered the map than the group recoiled at the stench emanating from the paper. Tabitha held the map at arm's length and said, "Ew, it really stinks." Griff took another sniff, winced, and said, "Ugh, it smells like goblins." The group agreed that the foul-smelling map had indeed come from the goblins, but they could come to no reasonable consensus on why Grumbleguts and Grimworthy would help them, other than to lead them into a trap. Before they could settle on a course of action, the treetops shook and a familiar chattering filled the air. Squirrelin and his demented chipmunk followers leapt down from above and surrounded them.
Squirrelin, enraged and indignant in seeing that the heroes had escaped his spell, declared them to be liars, deceivers, and cheaters, and insisted that, in order to pass, they must now solve a fourth forbidden riddle. With a fiendish grin, Squirrelin tucked his arm behind his back and said,
"The fourth forbidden riddle is, how many fingers am I holding up behind my back?"
Tabitha argued that guessing how many fingers someone was holding up behind his back was by no means a riddle, but Squirrelin was insistent. Unless they could provide the correct solution, he would use his magic to bar their way and trap them in the swamp forever. With no other option, Tabitha took her best guess. She asked if he had 3 fingers hidden behind his back. The chipmunks erupted with a blast of victorious cheers and shouts as Squirrelin declared her guess to be incorrect. He denied Tabitha's request for a second chance, and he and the chipmunks celebrated her misfortune as they swung from the branches, howling with delight. Tabitha was nothing if not resourceful, and she came up with a plan. Noting that Bartleby was a master of disguise and that Terence was an actor, a classically trained actor, the Tiger Man reminded her, Tabitha softly whispered her plan to them. Upon hearing her strategy, Mr. Wump opened his mouth in astonishment and said, "That's so crazy, it just might work." Bartleby reached into his cloak to retrieve his disguise kit, and then he and Terence, with Mr. Wump of course, quietly disappeared behind a group of trees. While they were gone, Sir Gladys, who'd been quite persistent about needing her afternoon tea, sat down on a nearby stump, opened her large handbag, and pulled out a teapot and a cup. Before long, she'd brewed herself a steaming pot of a very strong-smelling tea, and was just about to take a sip when she was startled by a ruckus coming from behind her. 3 bizarre-looking characters strode out of the swamp and wandered about, looking tired and lost. All 3 strangers wore brightly colored shawls wrapped around their necks, and they spoke with strong southern accents. The first stranger was very tall and broad, yet had the appearance of being quite feminine, as noted by her long pink hair and bright red lipstick, although the distinctive pattern of orange, black, and white stripes on her skin made her seem quite tigerish. The second stranger had a short beard and wild-looking eyes, but his most distinctive feature was his hair, which stood up in a very tall red mohawk. The third stranger was quite small, and it appeared that she was being carried in the second stranger's arms. She was somewhat sock-like, with big googly eyes and a pink tongue, but on her head she had a massive mound of blonde curls. The tigerish stranger wandered up to Squirrelin and said, "Oh dear, we are but 3 weary southern travelers, hopelessly lost in this dreadful swamp." The bearded, wild-eyed stranger said,
"Yes, but who can help us find our way home?"
Squirrelin eyed them with a curious but belligerent gaze and said,
"Stop! No one passes without answering the fourth forbidden riddle."
The small, sock-like stranger gasped and cried,
"Oh my, we're not very good at riddles."
With an antagonistic snicker, Squirrelin assured them that they could never solve the fourth forbidden riddle. Then he placed his arm behind his back and challenged them to guess how many fingers he was holding up. The tigerish stranger and the bearded stranger huddled in front of Squirrelin and lamented their ineptitude at solving riddles, and Squirrelin was so engrossed in their tale of suffering that he didn't notice when the small sock-like stranger, at the end of the bearded stranger's arm, slowly peeked over the wizard's shoulder. The sock-like stranger then whispered something into the bearded stranger's ear. The bearded stranger got down on one knee, and with an intensity that he seemed to be channeling from the great beyond, he gulped and sputtered and wheezed and said,
Oh my, is it 2 fingers?"
The contentious smirk melted from Squirrelin's face as he revealed his hidden hand to show that 2 fingers were in fact extended. The chipmunks roared their disapproval. Squirrelin, of course, accused them of cheating, but the 3 southern travelers begged him to uphold the agreement, pointing out that it would be terrible manners for him to go back on his word. And while Squirrelin labored over his decision, the sock-like stranger very carefully motioned for Tabitha, Shaolin, Sir Gladys, and Griff to tiptoe behind the deranged wizard. They did so, and they were so quiet that they attracted neither the attention of Squirrelin or his followers, although Sir Gladys nearly dropped her teacup in a puddle before Shaolin caught it. After much thought, Squirrelin sorely conceded that they had somehow solved his riddle, and he agreed to let them continue on, unimpeded. Once their friends had successfully passed from Squirrelin's sight, Terence, Griff, and Mr. Wump bid the wizard a fond adieu, complete with dramatically blown kisses. Then they followed their comrades into the shadows of the swamp and shed their disguises. Left alone in the swamp with his dejected chipmunks, a glum Squirrelin sighed and said,
"Well, I guess we need to research a fifth forbidden riddle now."
Then he said hopefully,
"Does anybody have a library card?"
Sadly, not a single chipmunk did. Meanwhile, Grumbleguts and Grimworthy had been leading Zabera and the prince around the swamp in circles, buying time so that they could spring their deceitful ambush once Tabitha caught up. But Zabera had grown impatient and threatened them with disembowelment if they didn't deliver her to the crown immediately, so the goblins had reluctantly fulfilled their tracking obligation. They had led the prince and the sorceress to the secret tomb of the last great emperor, which was concealed by overgrown vines and moss deep in the heart of the swamp. Zabera and the prince now stood in the damp, dark burial chamber, surrounded by artifacts and treasures of inestimable value. But the prince wasn't concerned with the trinkets and the goblets and the piles of gold. His focus was squarely on the gilded chest at the center of the room, the box that he knew held the crown of destiny.
"Oh, goody! I'm really going to be emperor!" he squealed.
Then he skipped about the tomb, clapping his hands while he sang,
"I'm going to be emperor! I'm going to be emperor! Hooray for me!"
But then he stopped abruptly, and he placed a finger on his lips, and a dark expression crossed his face, as though something of great significance had only just occurred to him. With a troubled tone in his voice, he said,
"Zabera, if the oracle's hex is the only thing keeping you away from the crown, what's stopping you from taking it from me once the quest is over?"
"Oh, I would never do something like that, sire," said Zabera with a smile that was as rigid as it was insincere.
"Really?"
said Skippy hopefully.
"Yes, really,"
Zabera spat. Then with a sharp motion she raised her staff and waved it in front of his face hypnotically. Skippy's eyes glazed over, and his knees went weak, and he swayed in time with Zabera's motions, his eyes following the crystal at the staff's head.
"Now take it," she said, "and once the hex is broken, give the crown to me."
Obediently, Skippy stumbled toward the chest, but he stopped abruptly as an arrow whizzed into the room and embedded itself in the ground at his feet. Zabera turned to see Shaolin entering the room, bow drawn for a second shot. She was followed by Tabitha, Bartleby, Terence, and Griff, with Sir Gladys taking up the rear. The goblins looked to one another and snickered with delight. "Not so fast, lady," shouted Tabitha. "We've come a long way for that crown." Zabera shot her a scornful look and said, "What are you going to do? You're just a little girl." Deeply offended, Terence squared his jaw and said,
Excuse me, we're also a classically trained actor, a kind of sort of pirate, a bossy archer, a sweet old lady, and a guy with a talking sock."
With that, Zabera raised her staff, and Griff drew his sword, and Shaolin drew back on her bow, and the goblins bared their claws, and Terence bared his teeth, and even Mr. Wump struck a threatening pose. And while all of this was going on, Sir Gladys tapped Griff on the shoulder and said,
"I'd like to finish my tea if I could."
Caught up in the tension of the moment, Griff shouted, "Whatever, Granny, just stay out of the way." Offended, Sir Gladys muttered,
"Well, right, there's no need to shout."
Then she sat down on a rock and finished the last of her tea. Seeing their master so thoroughly distracted, Grumbleguts and Grimworthy shared a wicked grin and prepared to spring their trap. But before they could, a small voice called out from the cave entrance. "Griff, are you okay? I thought I heard your voice." It was Coral, sweet and gentle Coral, who, still feeling awful about the way her sisters had treated Griff, had ventured out into the swamp all alone, in an attempt to check up on him again. Had she known the tense and potentially deadly situation she was walking into, she likely would have turned and run the other way. But unfortunately, she walked straight into the tomb and directly into the clutches of the goblins. Seeing that Zobeira's focus was now on them and the terrified mermaid, the goblins decided to delay their betrayal and instead snatched Coral tight in their claws. The little mermaid screamed in shock and terror.
"Look at what we has here," said Grumbleguts. "Fishy for dinner." "I loves fishy for dinner," said Grimworthy, licking her lips hungrily.
Seeing Coral in danger stirred up a primal and protective rage in Griff. He brandished his cutlass and demanded that the goblins release her or face the consequences. Not expecting such ferocity from their foe, the goblins were startled and loosened their grip on their captive. Infuriated by this unexpected standoff, Zobeira shouted impatiently to Prince Skippy, "Just take the crown, you weak-minded fool! Do it now!" Still in a daze, Skippy opened the lid of the gilded chest and reached inside.
"Bartleby, we've got to stop him!"
shouted Mr. Wump. Bartleby rushed to the chest and with his free hand struggled to stop Skippy from retrieving the crown, while Mr. Wump grabbed hold of the prince's nose and twisted. Skippy screeched in terror but refused to relinquish his grip on the crown of destiny. Shaolin pulled her bowstring back and prepared to fire her arrow straight at Zobeira's head. But before she could release the shot, Sir Gladys stood up, put her teacup back in her handbag, smacked her lips and said,
"Ah, that really hit the spot."
It was at that moment that, having finished her afternoon tea, Sir Gladys was finally ready to use her power of super speed. To Gladys, it didn't feel like she was moving quickly at all. In fact, she felt like she was moving at normal speed while everyone else stood absolutely still. And so it was that Sir Gladys, very calmly and with great deliberation, walked about the tomb and adjusted the situation, while everyone else hung in an apparent state of suspended animation. First, she took Zobeira's staff and turned it upside down, so that the jewel was now at the bottom instead of the top. Then she pulled Coral from the goblin's grasp and adjusted each of the goblin's fingers so that they were now on the verge of poking one another in the eyes. Next, she reached into the gilded box. With a giggle, she drew something from her handbag, placed it inside the chest, and made a few adjustments to the grip of Prince Skippy. Finally, she returned to Shaolin. The archer's bow was pulled as tight as it could go. The elderly knight paused and took a thoughtful moment, then adjusted the archer's aim so that her arrow was now pointed directly at Griff's backside.
"And that's for yelling at me,"
she said to Griff with a furrowed brow. Then she sat back down on her rock, opened her handbag, and munched a biscuit while time snapped back into normal speed. Then everything happened at once. The goblins poked one another in the eyes and screamed in agony.
"Ah, you poked me in the eyeses,"
screamed Grimworthy.
"No, you poked me in my eyeses,"
screeched Grumbleguts. Zobeira attempted to cast a spell, but because her staff was now upside down, the curse backfired and knocked her flying roughly against the wall of the tomb. Shaolin let loose her arrow, which buried itself directly into Griff's rump. He wailed in pain and panic, while Terence ran to assist him, and Prince Skippy, now nearly free of Zobeira's spell, retrieved his prize from the chest and placed it upon his head. He pranced about the tomb and said proudly,
"Bow down before your new emperor."
Tabitha looked at Skippy and burst out laughing. She laughed until her sides hurt. She pointed at the prince and tried to speak, but her laughter simply overwhelmed her. Shocked and confused by her unexpected reaction, Prince Skippy reached up on top of his head and pulled down the crown. Only it wasn't a crown at all. It was a toy of some sort. In fact, it was the favorite dog toy of Sir Gladys's pet Pomeranian, Puddles, which she'd carefully placed in the prince's hand. The toy looked like a rubber chicken, and it squeaked when Skippy squeezed it. His eyes filling with tears, he cried,
"Zobeira, what's happened? This isn't the crown. Oh, I look ridiculous."
With that, the prince ran shrieking from the tomb, sobbing and blubbering. Even after he left, Tabitha could hear his wails of humiliation trailing off into the distance. The goblins, their vision slightly restored, realized that their chance to take the crown had passed, but they had no plans to leave empty-handed. Grimworthy seized Coral by the arm and hissed,
"At least we still has our fishy dinner."
Then she and her goblin brother dragged Coral to the entrance of the tomb, holding the mermaid in front of them like a shield. They were about to run off into the night with their captive when a loud splashing sound from outside the tomb made them pause. They heard a harsh voice say, "Hey, you big greasy creeps, are you bothering our sister?" A second voice, even more cruel than the first, said, "'Cause nobody bugs our sister except us." Grumbleguts and Grimworthy turned around to see Mako and Moray emerging from the deep water of the swamp. And they weren't alone either. The entire pod was there with them. There was Pearl and Bubbles and Algie and Albacore and Sushi and Limpet. There was Minnow and Guppy too, plus at least a dozen other young mermaids who joined their sisters in glaring ferociously at the goblins. Mako cracked her knuckles menacingly, and Moray smacked her fist into the palm of her hand. Now goblins are scary creatures, but even goblins know that their chances of defeating an entire pod of angry mermaids are slim to non-existent. So with a gulp and a whimper, Grumbleguts and Grimworthy released Coral and stumbled off into the swamp, heads down, bodies trembling. "Aw, look at the little baby goblins. I think they're gonna cry," teased Mako. Then she and Moray set off after the terrified goblins and chased them off into the darkness. Coral ran to Griff, whose wounds were being tended to by a flustered Terrence.
"Oh, buddy. Oh, dear. Okay, it's not that bad," said Terrence. "I'm going to pull it out on 3. 1, 2.
Then with a great yank, Terrence pulled the arrow from Griff's backside. "What happened to 3?" Griff demanded.
"Sorry, I panicked,"
cried Terrence. Griff howled in torment and embarrassment as he clutched his aching buttocks, while Coral tried to comfort him. A few feet away, Shaolin stood transfixed, staring at her bow in shock. "I missed," she muttered to herself in disbelief. "I can't believe I missed." Zobara staggered to her feet and shouted, "Someone in this room has the crown, and whoever it is will surrender it to me now." Then with a murderous glint in her eye, she raised her staff, pointed it at Tabitha, and readied a deadly spell. The staff flew from her hands and slammed down onto the stone floor with such force that the crystal at its head shattered into a cloud of glowing green mist. Shocked and confused, Zobara recoiled as the oracle strode into the tomb. Her hands still glowed with the magical power she'd used to disarm her daughter. The oracle loomed over Zobara, who suddenly seemed very small and weak. Zobara's lip quivered slightly as her mother spoke. "Zobara, that is enough," came the oracle's booming voice. "The only reason I allowed you to undertake this quest in the first place is because I thought you might learn a lesson or two about humility and service to others. But it's clear now that you are not ready for that level of responsibility. So in turn, you will return home and you will clean your room." Trembling, Zobara pouted and cried, "No, no, Mother, my room's filthy. It will take me 100 years to clean it." The oracle narrowed her eyes and said, "I know. Now go, quickly, or I'll make you clean the bathroom too." And with that, Zobara stomped off, out of the tomb and into the night, presumably with a lifetime of housework ahead of her. Smiling, the oracle turned to Tabitha and said, "I must congratulate you all on the completion of your quest." Tabitha was confused. "But how can the quest be over?" she asked. "No one has the crown." With a dazed look on his face, Bartleby stepped forward. In his hand was a shiny silver crown. Dozens of precious jewels were set into its magnificent surface, and they glowed in the dim light of the tomb.
"I don't know what happened," he said in astonishment. "One second my hand was empty, then the next second I was holding the crown of destiny."
Sitting on her rock, Sir Gladys chuckled to herself and said,
"I know what happened, but no one would believe me if I told them."
Bartleby attempted to give the crown to Tabitha, stating that it had been her quest, and so the crown of destiny rightfully belonged to her. But with a smile, Tabitha refused to take it. "How did the proclamation go again?" she asked the oracle. The oracle smiled and nodded and said, "Whomever holds the crown of destiny when the quest is complete shall be declared emperor." Bartleby stood in shocked disbelief as the oracle placed the crown upon his head. The oracle explained that while he was a thief, Bartleby was truly good of heart and deeply generous of spirit, as evidenced by all of the money he'd stolen from the corrupt and given to the poor. The young mermaids gathered around Bartleby and bowed to him reverently as they proclaimed him emperor.
"Can you believe it, Mr. Wump?"
said Bartleby.
I think you mean Emperor Wump,
Mr. Wump replied. Then the puppet turned to the oracle and praised her for setting up such a perfectly awesome quest. Somehow, she'd known that everything would work out for the best, and that the events she'd set in motion would lead to peace and unity for the kingdom.
Good job, Oracle,
said Mr. Wump. Why, thank you, Mr. Wump, said the oracle with a smile. Terence smirked and said, You get that you're talking to a sock, right? The oracle frowned and said, Mr. Wump isn't a sock. He is a powerful and mysterious magical being, older than time itself. Really? Said Terence in astonishment. Oh, I'm so sorry, Mr. Wump.
Yeah, well, don't let it happen again, Whiskers, shouted Mr. Wump.
The mermaids escorted the new emperor and his cohorts back to the royal palace, where Bartleby's first decree was to name the top advisors to his court. Sir Gladys was chosen to lead his royal knights, and she agreed, provided there was always enough tea on hand. And sure enough, there always was. Sir Gladys the Swift trained those knights until the day she retired at the ripe old age of 125. Shaolin was asked to be Bartleby's royal archer. Her confidence shaken by having missed her first shot ever, Shaolin felt that she was a poor choice, but the new emperor insisted. She began practicing, something she hadn't done since she was very, very young, and over time, Shaolin regained not only her self-assurance, but also some much-needed humility. Terence was named as the director of the Royal Theatre, an honor which the gentle Tiger Man accepted with great reverence. He toured the kingdom with his traveling variety show, putting on plays and warning children to make good choices, like eating their vegetables and not working for bad guys, even if they needed the money. Griff was appointed the head of the Royal Navy, which meant that he would have not just one ship, but an entire fleet of ships under his control. Having recovered from his embarrassing injury, Griff had also forged a peace with the mermaids, whom he credited quite thankfully with rescuing Coral after she'd run off alone to find him. He and Coral were eventually married, and together Griff and the mermaid pod worked to keep the seas safe and orderly. And finally, there was Tabitha. The oracle praised her for her resourcefulness and ingenuity. I knew that there was more to you than just obnoxious remarks, said the oracle softly. Sometimes a good leader isn't the person who's the bravest or the strongest. Sometimes it's someone who can help people work together to overcome their differences. It was your quick wits that kept us working together as a team, Tabitha, said Bartleby. What can I do for you? With a grin, Tabitha said, Nothing. I didn't want to be Empress anyway. It sounds like too much work. I just didn't want my village to get demolished. So now, I just want to go home. Before she left, Bartleby insisted on having a royal celebration in her honor. During the great feast, Tabitha sat at the head of the table, surrounded by all of her friends, Shaolin, Sir Gladys, Terence and Griff, Bartleby, Mr. Wump, and even the great oracle. And people from every village and every town in the kingdom traveled for miles and miles to join the festivities, just so they could see the girl who'd completed the almost impossible quest. Written and read by Shan McFadden. Music by audionautics.com. This story has been adapted from a stage script written by Shan McFadden for Funfolk Theatricals of Millbrook.